There are multiple absolutely game-changing changes in this patch, and Leech is just the first of a few legitimately crazy ones. Only a few weeks after being buffed to a 4-2, Leech is now going back to a 5-5, and the patch notes effectively amount to basically a mea culpa. They tried to buff Leech to target things like Annihilus, Jane Foster, Cannonball, and Hela, and they found that Leech was not actually a particularly effective release valve at dealing with those cards. They were still good, even when Leech was everywhere. And Leech was everywhere. This was a card with a 25% play rate in top 10% infinite. It was a core component of the Blink deck, and I actually wonder how the Blink deck will manage to survive without it. Part of the reason the Blink deck was able to be such a compelling and powerful piece of Marvel Snap metagames was because it had Leech covering up for all of its major weaknesses. Your opponents couldn't reliably play things like Shang-Chi or Sage or the things that would get over the top of you. There are a lot of good ways to combat a deck like the Blink deck, and most of them involve either killing the things they play or making larger men than they can deal with. And the Blink deck doesn't actually have a lot of ways of dealing with either of those things, except for Leech. Leech was able to keep a lot of the bad matchups for this deck in check. However, there's one further issue that I think the Blink deck will face when losing Leech. There are not a lot of good replacements. When you look at the 4-cost spot, Jubilee, obviously, is excellent. The question then becomes, what else can this deck play? There's not actually another good spot on the 4, because what you're looking for, ideally, is a card that goes with Blink, a 4-cost with a powerful on reveal that you can then flip into another card with Blink to get some power out of it. That's the effective trade it's making, and there's really not a lot of cheap 4-costs with powerful on reveals. When you talk about another card, you're talking about like maybe replacing it with Iron Lad or something, but then you're just a deck that doesn't really interact with your opponent in a meaningful way. And if you're going to be a deck that doesn't really interact with your opponent in a meaningful way, you need to have more power than the Blink decks do. And I kind of start to think when I look at this that these decks might need to fully reconfigure themselves. We might be going back to 2 weeks ago and trying to figure out if the Blink stuff can fit in with other things as a supportive piece rather than as the dominant one. Because as the dominant one, I'm not really sure what other 4-drop you can seriously run. We're going to really have to start experimenting with Blink. As far as other things, I think that this change, among others, will allow decks like Bounce to thrive, will allow cards like Shang-Chi and Shadow King back into the metagame, and I think that interplay is going to be fairly interesting. Bounce got a significant upgrade with Sage, and that means that Bounce could be in a position where it puts out a lot of power while also throwing priority. I honestly wonder if cards like Ghost and Invisible Woman will become a major part of the metagame if Bounce becomes a major part of the metagame, because of the absolute ability to throw priority that the deck has and the vast amounts of power that it can output. Bounce already beat the Blink decks if they didn't get leeched, and now that Leech is not going to be a part of the Blink decks, Bounce is going to start beating those decks a lot more. Oh yeah, and they buffed Werewolf by Night too. It's going to 3-1, which is a change that I have advocated for in the past. But man, is it scary to see in real life. Werewolf at 3-1 is genuinely a little bit horrifying. Remember, when this card was a 3-3, it was just very clearly one of the best cards in the game, and I do think that 3-1 meaningfully weaker, that is a real thing. But 3-3 was extremely strong, 3-1 is still going to be pretty strong. This card is an early scaling card, and having cards like this is very important in the current metagame of Marvel Snap. It's good to have something like this in your deck because of the way that a lot of other decks tend to interact with it. Now, one thing that is striking about this is a Werewolf Bounce deck is generally a little bit harder to lose priority with than a non-Werewolf Bounce deck, because you obviously have a Werewolf on the board, he's a pretty big guy, and it's a little bit harder to lose priority and render yourself invulnerable to cards like Shang-Chi and Shadow King if you have a really big guy on the board. That could matter, but I think fundamentally, the pure power this card brings to bear is going to be a major factor in this metagame. I expect Werewolf by Night to be maybe not as good as he was, because when he was last a 3/3, obviously he had 2 extra points of power, but also he was in a metagame that had a lot more weak things happening as opposed to strong things. This was a metagame where he was like the last remaining one of the scalers. Elsa Bloodstone had just gotten nerfed. And that was sort of what allowed him to start breaking out. I believe that was around the time Angela got nerfed. Like, Werewolf was sort of the last one standing, and so that made him a lot more of a prominent piece. I still think he's going to matter a lot, but even in a bounce deck, you have to make some really significant sacrifices in order to fit him in. You can't just run every scaler and then some bounce cards and be like, it's going to be fine. You have to actually pick and choose your 12 cards with care. You have to actually pick and choose where your power goes with care. This is going to be a difficult deck to play, and he is one of many options now as opposed to the only option. It's also possible he ends up making Loki into more of a bounce deck right now. Loki has always sort of fused itself with the kind of cards that you really just sort of want to have alongside a powerful get card like Loki, which is to say the most efficient stats you can possibly get. Werewolf typically is that, and Loki is very interested in doing a lot of the things Werewolf is already very interested in. In summation, I have said that I thought Werewolf would be balanced at 3-1, and I believed that at the time, but seeing this in the actual patch notes, that's really scary. I'm really scared of this one. This could be a legitimate game changer. Grandmaster is getting a 2-power buff, a buff I think it's long deserved. This is a card that a lot of people wanted to be good, a lot of people bought expecting to try to make it good, and they were just unable to do it because not only is it 0 power, it's also removing power from the lane you play it in exchange for 0 power. I don't know if that's really going to make it go anywhere. One thing that I think of when I see this card, though, is just how relevant something like maybe, I don't know, Ghost into double Shang-Chi could be against a bounce deck, right? This card multiplying Shang-Chi and Shadow King is what I would be wanting to do with it. I think most other implementations of it, I don't actually like. I think most other implementations of it strike me as a little bit too magical Christmas land, where everything has to go right for it to be reasonable, and when it doesn't go right, the card sucks, and you're just sitting there. And like, yeah, it's not a 2-0 anymore, but it still is a 2-2, and that's not really that good. This card is very compelling, though, in the context of multi-Shang-Chi. Like, if the meta starts looking like all bounce, I am going to be trying, Ghost, Invisible Woman, tech cards, right? Because all the bounce stuff is like Sage, it's Werewolf, it's all this stuff that eats it to Shang-Chi, it eats it to Shadow King, and being able to do, like, Shadow King multiple lanes against a bounce deck will win you that game. Like, they are not good at just stats. All their stats are green. You get rid of all that stuff, you're probably going to win the game. Hits an Angela, hits a Wolf, hits a Bishop, hits a Hitmonkey, hits a Sage. It's all green stats, and having that effect twice is super interesting. The real question is, where is that going to be better than playing Absorbing Man? And I think that's a real, like, kind of a head scratcher for me, where it's hard for me to think of something broken that this does, but it's easy for me to think of, oh, this is like a kind of cheaper Absorbing Man that I can, like, fit into my curve a little better, maybe. Like, that's a cool thing to do with it. That's something I'm interested in. I also wanted to address, and this will come up again with another one of these cards, but what I really wanted to address was there's this pervasive belief that Grandmaster would be better if he was made a 2-1 instead of a 2-2, and I really want to sort of push back on that. I get it, he'd be able to work with Ravonna. People overrate synergy. People overrate synergy, and they always have. In the early days of Marvel Snap, one of the things that would happen was a card would get nerfed, its power would get reduced, and everyone would say, oh, but that's a buff with Mr. Negative. And it gradually became a meme, right? Ha 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 ha. People meant that. And they mean it now when they say, oh, well, actually, less power is better because it synergizes with Ravonna. No. More power, better card. Just, that's how it works. Yes, it is going to be worse in certain hyper-specific situations. That doesn't make it a worse card. It probably makes it a better card because then it's better on average. The long-awaited buff to Captain America makes it an interesting and fairly unique card. This is now a 3-2 that gives other ongoing cards +2 power. I think a lot of people are going to be very excited about this. I don't really see it as an incredibly good piece of cardboard, so to speak, here. I'm not really buying this. Like, it strikes me as the kind of card that does probably want to go in your, like, Jean Grey ongoing deck, which is a fairly good deck, and there are some other cards in here that are being nerfed in relation to how good they are in that deck. But the thing is, that deck already has US Agent to win the Jean Grey lane, it has Mojo to win the Jean Grey lane, it typically doesn't need more than that, and so I'm not really sure it needs Captain America in the same way. I'm interested to see what this card ends up doing, because I kind of think that while it has a higher ceiling, it ends up in a niche that is already very occupied, which is full lane winners in an ongoing deck. There's actually kind of a lot of those, not just the two I mentioned, but like Iron Man, stuff like that. Like, there's a lot of full lane winners in an ongoing deck. That's actually kind of what the strategy is predicated on with the Jean Grey. It doesn't need another one of those. So I'm interested to see where this card lands. I definitely do want to see if it's possible to make any of this happen. I am fairly certain some joker in the comments will be like, ah yes, you play it in Cerebro too to give your Cerebro +2 power, thus making it actually Cerebro itself. And, you know, I can't argue, I suppose, but I can't imagine that's the most effective thing to do. It's cool, though. Here's the other card that I think people sort of overrate the synergy on. A lot of the reaction I saw to the leaks of this patch were, why did they nerf Baron Mordo? And that seems ridiculous to me. The reason people are saying that he got nerfed is because he no longer draws a card and does not go with Ronan the Accuser anymore, which is absurd. There are good Ronan decks right now. None of them play Baron Mordo. The reason they don't play Baron Mordo is he sucks, and you have way better options for putting cards in your opponent's hand. So it's not actually even a reduction in synergy. He's just not a card you play anyway. You want to play Maximus. That's a way better version of this effect. And actually, this card, this version of Baron Mordo, where it sets the top card of your opponent's deck to 6 cost, that card strikes me as pretty strong. I'm not sure how strong it is. It looks like it's Iceman to me. This is 2 cost Iceman. My real question, though, is until turn 6. My understanding of that means that it resets on turn 6. That's my understanding of that, meaning that it will still be playable at its normal cost on the final turn of the game. Is that going to be bad? Because, like, it seems like this is the kind of card where it's like, if you hit something really relevant with it, 2 cost Iceman is like, you're basically just taking away a draw from them. But it has to be a card that they want to play on those turns. And that is another kind of interesting thing. Like, this card seems better against decks that are looking to very specifically curve out. Like, as an example, the Blink deck would not really want to see this, right? Because, okay, my 4-drop just got, now I can't play it, right? My 5-drop, now I can't play it, right? That kind of deck really doesn't want to see this. So in a metagame where there is a dominant deck, and we just left one of those metagames, I'm saying left, I don't know that we've left it, but I'm expecting that we do. In a metagame where there's a dominant deck that is just playing 1 card a turn, this is phenomenal. In a metagame where there are like combo decks that really need to play specific stuff on specific turns, this card is phenomenal. In a metagame where decks are playing like bounce stuff, I'm really not sure how much sense this card makes if it resets on the final turn of the game, because that deck really wants to explode on the final turn of the game anyway. But the point I think I want to make here is I think they made Baron Mordo into a card that is actually kind of a compelling and interesting card, and I honestly think that there's a distinct possibility that this card is not necessarily like just compelling and interesting, but like there are worlds where this is a card that a lot of people play and it's really not fun. Like, I'm not saying this is as good as 2 cost Black Widow. I don't really think it is. But we all remember how nightmarish that was, right? Blanking a draw and all that awful stuff. This is 2-3. Like, there's not nothing to that comparison here. I don't think it's better, right? Like, I don't really think it's better. It's more like 2 cost Iceman, like big Iceman, right? This is the Rock Slide. Like, the analogy here is like, as Korg is to Rock Slide, Iceman is to Baron Mordo, I think. And that's just, like, a pretty good card, right? That strikes me as something that is, like, genuinely relevant, some disruption that I actually might want to see, and is no longer giving your opponent the free advantage of drawing a card. Big buff to this card. Huge. I mentioned nerfs to the ongoing list, and Spectrum is getting a nerf, which is just a crazy sentence to say. They mention in the notes that they think the ongoing list is actually like a balance issue. I mean, I guess they have numbers that I don't really have access to. I can tell you that it did not strike me as anything near a balance issue every time I played it, but it is a very easy deck to play, and those decks tend to sort of hit their thresholds for balance issues a little bit sooner than, you know, something like Loki, right? There's been a lot of discussion around Loki recently, and his numbers are bad, but a lot of the top 100 plays them. Like, I get it, right? It is probably true that decks that are easier to play end up on the balance radar earlier because of that, and Loki's a typically very hard deck to play, whereas Spectrum is very typically an easy deck to play. Sure. The other thing they note when they nerf this card going to 6 power is that they are concerned that the Captain America buff might make ongoing that strategy a little bit too strong, and they were already kind of on the fence about nerfing it, so they wanted to make sure that they brought it back into line. I don't know about that. Like, I'm not sure Captain America's actually all that good. It has a lot of options for that slot already. He is a good budget US agent, I will say that. Like, if you're only missing US agent from that deck, you can absolutely try Captain America. I mean, US agent's going to be better, but that is what it is. I do think it's good that the deck exists. And I think that's what worries me about this. Because, like, this is a deck that is mostly built around, like, Series 1, 2, and 3 cards. Jean Grey's like a core piece. US Agent is running it, but not necessarily mandatory. He's just very good. He's very good everywhere. And you end up in a situation where, like, this is a deck that I think a lot of people who are just entering into, like, the final stages of the game can build into. I don't like nerfing it. I like those people having good decks. I get why they feel like if the numbers suggest that it has to be nerfed, I get it. But I just don't, it just leaves like kind of a bad taste in my mouth when they nerf like cheapo decks. I get it though. I really do. Like if the numbers say it's actually a problem and like it's fine. I don't really have access to those numbers. I don't know what numbers they're looking at, but I'm not going to sit here from the outside and be like, you're lying about the numbers because they don't match my subjective experience. That seems like a pretty dumb thing to do, so I'm not going to do that. Yeah, pretty reasonable nerf to Spectrum. They hit it about as minimally as they possibly could. I hope that deck still remains a good and powerful budget option for players going in to the later stages of the game. The Luke Cage nerf probably catches some people off guard. I wouldn't be shocked if people were like, what the hell is going on here? Why is Luke Cage getting a nerf? That's ridiculous. Here's the thing. Luke Cage is actually just a really good card right now. Like a pretty key piece of Noki, a pretty key piece of the Spectrum decks. He's just really very strong. I totally understand why they nerfed him. I wouldn't be like number one on my list, but I get it, right? And another thing this nerf does is make him a more viable option for Cerebro 3, a deck that I think actually did need the help, while not necessarily impacting him overly in terms of just how good he is. You're mostly playing for him for his effect anyway a lot of the time. He's going to be worth more than the points he has on the card in most games where you play him, whether that be because of a Valentina, US Agent, various other afflictions that you're getting rid of. It makes sense. I'm not overly opposed to it. It's fine, right? I should also note that I believe, according to the data mines, at some point in the near future, there's going to be a card releasing called Ajax that scales off of the amount of afflicted power on the board, and a card releasing called Cassandra Nova that afflicts cards in the deck with negative power. And I am sort of wondering if they're like, all right, Luke Cage is already very strong. We don't want to release these cards that do this affliction stuff into a metagame with Luke Cage. I wonder if that entered into it. They didn't really talk about that, but I do wonder. I have some speculative ideas about that. Obviously, like, there's a pretty decent chance I'm just talking out of my ass here, but I do think that it is interesting to note that this card got nerfed. I think a lot of people are going to be like, I don't understand it. I honestly do understand it. Even if you take out the future-looking stuff with, like, those cards coming out, I think this card actually was very strong, and I am relatively fine with it being nerfed, especially since a lot of Cerebro players are just going to call this a buff anyway. It's kind of a wash, right? So it's kind of a free change to make. Leader is getting a point of power. I don't really think this matters a ton to Leader. It's interesting that in the notes they note that they thought that Red Hulk was going to be a card that got answered by Leader, and that didn't really end up happening. Leader's major issue is his struggles with clogged boards. That's sort of the reason why he's not seeing a lot of play right now. His other major issue is like his very specific sort of awkward interactions with things that have like an effect like Blink, for example, things that are like just sort of difficult to plan for. Things like that is another issue Leader has. And finally, he just doesn't have any really good homes. It's hard to fit him in a deck. When you're looking for 6-drops, he's usually like the 4th on the list. You're looking at like Doctor Doom, you're looking at Magneto, you're looking at Red Hulk in some order, and then it's like Leader, and no deck can really afford to play that many 6-drops, and so you're just in this spot where it's like, okay, this is very hard for me to fit into my decks. You have this other problem where it's like, okay, I could run a Red Hulk or I could run a leader to beat Red Hulk, but it never makes a ton of sense to run leader to beat Red Hulk when you could just play your own Red Hulk and beat Red Hulk that way, right? And so you end up in this awkward spot where it's like, if I play against Hela, I'm gonna like absolutely die if I have leader instead of Red Hulk. It's like an unbelievable L. And so if I actually have Red Hulk, I can compete on power. It just makes him very hard to actually justify putting in decks. And I think his fundamental issue is being conditional. And when he is conditional, an open metagame gives him just a ton of trouble. In a hyper-specific metagame where there's only a few things you have to do, yeah, he's a better card, but he's not necessarily good enough to justify running over the other three. Additionally, the Leech nerf should help this guy a little bit. There was definitely a big component to why he wasn't seeing play was Leech exists, and that's a huge problem. So generally, I think this card is still going to be in a pretty awkward place. I am sort of like noting like, hey, they just buff Leech. Now they're going to buff Leader. Why are they buffing all these cards everyone hates? I don't think this is going to have nearly the same effect as the Leech buff did. The Leech was sort of him being hot-shotted into a perfect situation in the meta. Leader's getting a point of power. There's a pretty meaningful difference here. Finally, Sentry is getting a 2-power nerf to 4/8, and the Void is getting technically a 2-power buff to 4-8. This is actually, I believe, what he released at. I think this is a pretty smart way of attacking what is fundamentally a problem that Leech was meant to solve. They mentioned in the notes that they were trying to find a good workaround for Annihilus, a way to make him not the way that he was. Annihilus, an excellent, phenomenal card before Leech, and likely to be another excellent card afterwards. The interplay between Clog decks and Bounce decks is a fascinating one, because on the one hand, Clog is good against Bounce, but on the other hand, they can bounce the stuff that clogs them, and so it's a little bit bad against Bounce. Very fascinating. This nerf actually does strike me as fairly impactful. I mean, it basically goes from making the Annihilus play for make the Sentry play for an effective 20 to playing for an effective 16. That's meaningful. That's like a really meaningful change in how good this actually is. I'm not saying a lot of people are going to be contesting a -8 lane, but it's more than we're contesting a -10 lane, I can tell you that. That's a very interesting change to me. I'm glad they're addressing Annihilus instead of just buffing Leech to deal with it, because we saw how that went. I do wonder what the holdup is on Annihilus, but I also think, when I think about it, I find it hard to create an Annihilus nerf that actually is meaningful. I think a lot of people are just like, oh, just take another point of power off. And it's like, is that meaningful? This is way more meaningful than taking a point of power off Annihilus, right? So it ends up looking kind of like a little bit of a rework if you end up doing something to Annihilus, and that's like kind of a big undertaking. So I guess I understand why they aren't dealing with Annihilus right now, and why this was a preferable option. Make no mistake, this is a like 4-point nerf to your power output of your nut draw when this deck goes off. That's really remarkable. Like, I'm surprised they went this hard on it. Maybe 4-9 would have felt too on the nose with Shang-Chi there. This is meaningful. This is legitimately interesting, and I am interested to see what this does to the metagame, if it turns out this is actually something that can be easily overcome, or if this just ends up being exactly as strong as it always was. Okay, so top line view. Ding dong, the Leech is dead. We all feel good about that. Werewolf by Night, definitely the next scary thing that I'm worried about. I sort of expect the day one metagame to have a lot of bounce stuff going on, and since there's a lot of bounce stuff going on, I expect to be playing some Ghosts, some Invisible Woman, to try to get some tech on the board, Shadow King, Shang-Chi, just be that person everyone really hates, right? Maybe I'll put a Grandmaster in there, just play like the Thor's deck with all the tech, stuff like that. Just really try to rob people, right? Like that's really what I'd be trying to accomplish here, because I think a lot of people are going to be very excited at the point output of Bounce, and frankly, I don't really envy the task of trying to go points for points with a deck like that. I kind of think it's sort of a lost cause, so in order to combat a deck like that, I will want to be playing a lot of tech. So I expect the first few days to be kind of a lot about that. A lot about Werewolf, a lot about Sage, a lot about Bounce, a lot about Green Power, a lot about Shadow King, a lot about Shang-Chi, maybe some Throwing Power, Invisible Woman Killmonger, maybe some Super Giant, like stuff like that I expect to be like the interplay of the first few days of the meta. There are a bunch of changes in here, but those are the ones that really strike me as like, whew. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. Let me know what you think in the comments. I haven't said this in a while. I still read all of them. Like, I still read every comment on my channel. Let me know what you think about this patch. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. Enjoy the KM boost, and I'll see you in the next one.